Please welcome to the stage General David Petraeus, Chairman, KKR Global Institute, and Gerard Baker, Editor, Wall Street Journal.
Good morning. Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here with General Petraeus. Very timely opportunity to talk about the state of the world, in particular the U.S. role in it, given what's been going on in the last few weeks. General, I want to start straight away asking you. President Biden was here in New York yesterday, spoke to the UN Assembly, and he said that the era of relentless war, the relentless wars that the U.S. has been fighting, most obviously for 20 years in Afghanistan, is over, and we're now into a period of relentless diplomacy. But let me ask you, is that period of relentless war actually over, given what we've seen in Afghanistan over the last few weeks?
Well, it's dramatically reduced. First of all, thanks for doing this.
Thank you.
It's great to see you again. Thanks for the opportunity to be on a real stage in a real city with a real audience, the hardy few, the proud, but many more virtually. Certainly the enormous resources to which we have devoted to this war, those are dramatically reduced. I mean, when I commanded in the surge in Iraq, it was 165,000 Americans alone. In Afghanistan, we had 100,000 Americans, 150,000 total. So certainly the numbers are dramatically reduced. But make no mistake about it, there are still Islamist extremists out there. He has rightly described them as having metastasized. So we still have 7,000 troops just in various places in Africa alone. And kudos to the administration for keeping them there, slightly beefing up Somalia, keeping them in northeastern Syria, keeping them in Iraq, albeit not in a combat role, but they weren't doing combat missions anyway. They're doing advise, assist, and enable. And frankly, we are still going to have to devote enormous resources because of the distances that they have to cover. Keep in mind that we have no bases anymore anywhere in Central or South Asia. So everything we do to identify what the Islamic State, which is at its all-time high in the Afghanistan-Pakistan region, 2,000 fighters, and has already been conducting attacks, not just the one at Kabul airport, that tragic loss of 13 of our men and women in uniform and nearly 200 innocent Afghan civilians, but this weekend in Jalalabad and a variety of others. So the Taliban are now going to have to become, in a sense, counter-terrorist or counterinsurgents. And they're going to find out that's a lot less fun than being the insurgents who can sort of hang out with each other and then decide when they want to attack and then pull back. And they're going to have to govern, too.
But do you think the way in which we ended the war has improved, has enhanced American security, or do you think actually we're now more vulnerable given the situation in Afghanistan?
I think it's hard to say that this has improved our security, just in part because of the reputational damage, frankly, the credibility, China, this plays into their narrative. As you know, China has long said that the U.S. is a power in decline. It is an unreliable partner, and they immediately started saying that, and of course pointing towards Taiwan as they said that. Now, there's a lot of initiatives that the administration had already taken and has taken even since our withdrawal. The AUKUS, Australia, UK, US is a very important step forward. Now, it could have been done a little more deftly diplomatically, so we didn't strike such a blow to the longest standing alliance between the US and any other country, in this case, France. But no, I think there's damage there. And then keep in mind, again, we've lost the bases from which we used to conduct the, quote, regional counterterrorism campaign, read Western Pakistan. And we have no nearby bases to keep an eye on the Islamic State or on al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda being generally a partner with the Taliban, the Islamic State being an enemy, and a very barbaric enemy.
But you know, the administration says we've got this over-the-horizon capability to deal with terrorism. We've got bases all around the region. It was time to leave. We can secure. We can take care of American security without having to have a deployment of U.S. forces on the ground in Afghanistan. I take it you don't agree with that.
No, we have all of that. It's just going to be very, very costly.
But you don't. You think the decision to pull out was wrong? Do you?
I think we had alternatives. Yeah. And again, it's very hard for me to look at what has transpired and say that that is anything but heartbreaking, tragic, and frankly disastrous. I mean, however imperfect that government was, they were a partner in the fight against Al-Qaeda in that region, the fight against Islamic State. We destroyed the Islamic State a few years ago already, but you have to keep doing that. Again, they were full of flaws, but wasn't that a lot better for the 50% of their population that is women? Wasn't it better in general? Now, you can differentiate between rural and the metropolitan areas and the rest of that, but again, having that replaced by the Taliban, who may not this time take the country all the way back to the 7th century with their interpretation of Sharia law, but will take it back many centuries. And they already are. They basically have told women who had government positions in Kabul, don't bother to show up unless you are in a position that only can be done by a woman, such as an attendant at a female latrine or something like this. So again, I find it very hard to see that this is an enhancement to our national security. Yes, we get to withdraw 25 or 3,500 troops, but you've done a lot of damage to our alliances, which are hugely important for what is the most important endeavor in the world, which is the creation of a coherent, comprehensive whole of governments with an S on the end, all of our partners and allies policy for China. That's the if you think of us as the guy in the circus who has to keep plate spinning, the China plate, together with our allies and partners, that is the most important plate of all. It's bigger than all the others put together. But that doesn't mean that you can let these other little plates drop. And as I said, to be fair to the administration, they're maintaining these other plates. Yes. They're keeping them spinning because they know, they learned actually. This is the administration that withdrew forces from Iraq, and within a couple of years they had to go back because the Islamic State established the first ever caliphate, and we enabled the Iraqi and Syrian democratic forces to defeat that caliphate. But we have to keep an eye on Afghanistan. I don't see a near-term threat even to our allies in Europe, much less to our allies or to our homeland. But we have to keep in mind a drone, which is an integral element of a counterterrorism campaign, flying from either Qatar or the United Arab Emirates, is going to spend about 60% of its flight time just going to and from Afghanistan.
But also, and it needs, as we've seen tragically in the last couple of weeks, you need good intelligence on the ground.
You do.
To make sure that the people, the guys you're targeting are the right targets. And we spectacularly failed a couple of weeks ago, and presumably that intelligence is only going to get worse. The situation we're in is only going to get worse.
And that's while we still had at least residual human intelligence and other capacities that we had that we will not have, having completely withdrawn from Kabul and Kabul airport. Keep in mind, we don't even have an embassy. I think we probably should go back into this $500 billion or $1 million embassy. We need that, actually. For now, we'll do it through Doha, Qatar.
But you know the argument, the US, we've been there for 20 years, tragically, 2,500
We've been in Korea for 71 years.
Yeah, but it's not quite, it's true, but in Korea you do have a stable democratic government. We're not there.
We did not in the first decade.
Let me put it this way, if we pulled out our forces from Korea tomorrow, the Korean government wouldn't collapse to some terrorist-supporting organization.
But in its first decades, again, we didn't have strategic patience here. Let's keep in mind, our own history should be cautionary in this note. Our own country, 70 years or so after our Declaration of Independence, fought a brutal civil war. That's how unstable we were. We then had a century of Jim Crow laws, and legal segregation. We had corruption over the years. So again, we have to be a little bit modest, I think, in our judgment of others.
But it has been 20 years. I mean, you say, I don't want to pursue this historical analogy too far, but 20 years after the Second World War, Japan in 1965, US could have pulled its forces out of Japan in 1965, and Japan would not have gone back to, to the days of, of the Japanese Empire. Korea, we could have pulled our forces out of Korea 20 years after the end of the Korean War in the 1970s. Korea wouldn't have gone back. It is, don't you think that it is remarkable that 20 years, $80 billion, thousands of American lives and Allied lives, tens of thousands of Afghan lives, and we invested so much in this country, and the institutions of this country that we helped build collapsed like a house of cards in days.
It was entirely predictable. We pulled out our 3,500 troops. Whether they liked it or not, our NATO and other partners in that coalition in Afghanistan couldn't stay without us. That eats at them, and it should, but it's a reality of life. they pulled out their 8,500 troops. And when I heard that we were pulling out our 18,000 contractors who maintained the very sophisticated US-provided helicopters and planes, that's when I knew we could have a potential psychological collapse of the military forces of Afghanistan, and I said so at the time. And what happened is you have Afghan forces, who, by the way, let's remember how hard they had been fighting. They lost 66,000 members of their security forces. That's 27 times the number of U.S. losses. So the idea that they wouldn't fight is just not accurate. Right. The other inaccuracy is the idea that they had 300,000 troops and the Taliban only had 75,000. At least half of those 300,000 were actually cops on the beat, border police, customs police, any number of. So you're now down to well under half of that. 30,000 or so are in reserve, great, really high quality special forces. And then you have the rest defending what they have to do as a counterinsurgent. You have to defend population centers and critical infrastructure. So you're now down to fairly small numbers. The Taliban, quite impressively, massed considerable forces against these in various locations around the country simultaneously. And the idea had to be, for a country that is very mountainous and has limited road infrastructure, it had to be that the reinforcements are taken out to these different battles by a mixture of C-130 aircraft, fixed wing, and then helicopters that get them out to the battlefield. What happened is, early on, that was working. It worked, for example, for a while in Kandahar, some of the other places. They fought pretty hard for a number of days. But then the Afghan forces realized our Air Force, helicopters and planes, have basically become inoperable or shot up or damaged, what have you. And they couldn't be returned to service because we'd pulled the 18,000 contractors who did that. By the way, we insisted on providing those aircraft as well, rather than, say, Russian or Soviet ones. And so the problem then is that the Afghan forces realize nobody is bringing the reinforcements, nobody is bringing emergency resupply, and nobody is providing close air support. So what are they going to do? I think this was entirely predictable, and you had an epidemic of surrender that followed. And of course, again, we weren't prepared for that because clearly we had pulled our military out before pulling out the diplomats, the U.S. citizens, the green card holders. We had to go back in to Kabul airport and so forth.
Well, let's look forward. We've looked at the past, but let's look forward. How much more? How do you assess the risk now of renewed jihadi terrorism now that the Taliban, who after all were the government that harbored Al-Qaeda, who committed the attacks
and
on 9/11,
refused to remove them from their soil, they were given an
ultimatum and paid the price.
Yes.
Obviously, how much are we basically back to where, are we potentially back to where we were in August 2001?
Too early to tell, I think. I think we have to see, is this new Taliban government, and keep in mind the identities of these individuals. When you have the Minister of Interior, who is Siraj Haqqani, who has a $10 million bounty on his head, right. Many of the other ministers, at least third to a half, actually are designated in some form as terrorists or what have you. But will this be a kindler or Taliban? Or will it, again, return the country of the 7th century with a very, very ultra-conservative, almost extreme interpretation of Sharia law? And we just don't know. Now, they're about to find out that it's a lot harder to be the counterinsurgent than to be the insurgent, because you're actually responsible. You have to govern. You have to keep the lights on. You have to pay salaries. And keep in mind that the U.S. paid the salaries for 300,000 security forces, all their operating expenses. That's gone. The U.S. and other donor nations, Japan, UK, and others, paid 75% of the budget. That's unlikely. Yes, we're all concerned about the humanitarian disaster that lies ahead because they already had a drought. They import a lot of what is eaten. They import electricity from the north. They import refined fuel products from Iran that also generates electricity. They have a massive current account, trade deficit. And again, the West, U.S. and others, made up the difference. That's unlikely. You could actually see the lights go out in Kabul. They're going to be in a very, very difficult situation.
We just have a few minutes left, General. It's great to have you here and to have your time. So I want to just move on to one or two broader topics. You've already mentioned China and the U.S. posture towards China. Are we handling that right? China's obviously the biggest strategic challenge for the United States, perhaps in American history. Who knows? Do you think we're getting that right now? I mean, or what would you do? What would you have us do that we're not doing in terms of managing the challenge from China?
Look, I think that the administration actually is taking what was provided before, which had certain aspects that were, again, right. There were some others, especially in dealing with some of our allies and partners that were not. And I think this administration very impressively, prior to the withdrawal from Afghanistan and then prior to the diplomatic consequences of this Australia, UK, US deal, which seemed to catch the French.
You like that, by the way? You think that's a good?
I think it's a huge step forward. I mean, number
submarine
one, it's
element
a vastly better. It's a much better submarine. It's nuclear rather than diesel. It's longer duration, quieter. They probably get them sooner. Hopefully, the cost. We'll see how that works out. But the challenge there is, again, clearly Australia. We should have ensured that Australia was in dialogue with France, saying, look, we appreciate that deal, but, we're re-examining. We may go in a different direction, how that stuff. And you start that 3 or 4 months ago, and then you just keep, and so there's no surprise, and there's no sense of U.S. betraying our longest.
Could have been handled better, but you think that's absolutely a vital component in
Very
this.
much so. I mean, this is Australia voting. Not that they had already a vote. I mean, we already have the ANZUS alliance. They're part of the Five Eyes. They have been very, I think, quite impressive in how they have dealt firmly but not provocatively with the challenges out there. So yeah, I do. But the big issue, let me come back to what the biggest of the big ideas for today is for the entire world and for the U.S. It is to create a coherent, comprehensive, whole of governments with an S on the end approach to China. And by and large, this administration is very much getting that right. Now, again, there's going to have to be some repair of bruises over the non-consultation on Afghanistan and just the hurt feelings that, and part of it's their own fault because they realize they can't stay without us. And they resent that, but okay, so spend 2% of GDP on defense. And
is there a role for NATO in this? I mean, obviously, what's happened with
I
France
think there is.
casts you doubt. President Macron's already declared NATO brain dead. The U.S. is obviously pivoting towards the Indo-Pacific.
So.
Is there?
There is, but it's not going to be it's not going to be the central element. It's not going to be the element that it was during, say, the Cold War with the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact. But to come back to this, if you look at this, I think, again, very impressively, the administration has marshaled all these different initiatives. They very impressively went out first to the Quad at the summit level, then all the other countries in the Indo-Pacific not in the Quad, then to the G7 summit with the UK, of course, as well, EU summit, NATO summit with Putin, and then prepared to engage with China. But then, of course, Afghanistan intruded and really took us off our game a bit. But the only element that I think is actually missing in this coherent, comprehensive approach is trade. And you see China trying to get into the TPP. And we should have been in the TPP in the first place. And I'm astonished that a Republican administration, when it had fast-track authority, did not do that. And it's very difficult domestically, I understand, but that is a big glaring absence in this overarching approach, which otherwise, I think, has been impressive, albeit, we're still in just over the first half of the first year of the administration.
We've just got a minute left, so very finally, I mean, how do you assess the strategic, the immediate strategic threat from China? Obviously, everybody's very focused on Taiwan. They've made belligerent noises about it, as you say. After the Afghanistan pullout, perhaps they're emboldened. Are we at risk of something of real kinetic activity from the Chinese right now with regard to Taiwan? We've seen what they've done. You don't think so?
Yeah, no. I mean, first and foremost, let's remember all that matters for China and President Xi right now is re-election in October of next year.
Right.
So there'll be a lot of campaigns that are all leading to that. You're seeing some of these, again, Common Prosperity and all the other initiatives that he has launched. All of that's going to be ongoing. The question is, after that, can we by then have the kind of relationship that can influence a bit what goes on in Beijing? And then also, frankly, can we shore up our deterrence enough? And this is where Afghanistan matters, because keep in mind that deterrence is a function of the adversary's perception of your capabilities and your willingness to employ them. And if you're not willing to keep 3,500 troops in Afghanistan, and you hadn't taken a battle loss for 18 months.
Right, so if you're the Chinese, if you're Xi Jinping, the Chinese military, don't you look at that and think there might not be a better time to really assert our
look, I'm certain, I mean, there's a brilliant team around the president. I'm certain they're keenly aware of this. They're not going to come out the podium and say, we need to shore up our credibility vis-a-vis Beijing. But they will be very forthright internally. And in fact, AUKUS is a huge step forward in that regard. And there's lots of other initiatives ongoing, again, from the Department of Defense, which is completely going through a transformation process to ensure that we go from, huge, very expensive, very heavily manned, exquisite capability platforms to much smaller, much cheaper, autonomous, semi-autonomous, unmanned, but still very capable systems. And that's a big transformation.
We could talk about this all morning. Sadly, we're out of time. But ladies and gentlemen, please join me in thanking General David Petraeus, not just today, but for all he's done over an extraordinary career. Thanks very much.
Hey, thank you, Gerard.
Thank you.